The morning of February 8, 1942, Lieutenant Colonel James Whitfield of the 2nd Battalion, Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders, stood at the observation post on Mount Faber and watched the Japanese 25th Army tear through the Johore Causeway defenses like tissue paper in a monsoon. 3 months earlier, he had believed Singapore was impregnable. The Royal Navy's Far East Command had assured every officer from Kuala Lumpur to Darwin that Fortress Singapore could withstand any assault the Japanese Imperial Army might attempt. The massive 15-inch naval guns of the Singapore fixed defenses dominated the sea approaches with a range of 25 miles. The naval base at Sembawang housed the mightiest battle fleet east of Gibraltar. The RAF maintained 4 operational airfields with over 200 modern aircraft. Singapore was the Gibraltar of the East, the anchor of British power in the Pacific, the shield that protected Australia and India from Japanese aggression. Whitfield had arrived in Singapore aboard the transport HMS Duchess of Richmond in November 1941, part of the emergency reinforcement following the deteriorating situation in the South China Sea. The 2nd Battalion, Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders had been stationed in India for 18 months, growing soft on garrison duty in Bombay and Delhi. The men complained about the heat, the food, the boredom. Singapore promised action, purpose, the chance to bloody the nose of Japanese forces that had been probing British positions in Malaya since the summer. The battalion commander, Lieutenant Colonel Ian Stewart, had addressed the men on the deck of the Duchess of Richmond as they steamed through the Straits of Malacca toward their destination. The Japanese, he explained, were excellent fighters in China against poorly equipped Chinese forces, but they had never faced professional European troops with modern weapons and superior training. The 25th Army, commanded by Lieutenant General Tomoyuki Yamashita, might number 60,000 men, but they were stretched across the entire Malayan peninsula. British and Commonwealth forces in Malaya and Singapore totaled over 85,000 troops, including the veteran 8th Australian Division, the 11th Indian Division, and the 1st Malayan Infantry Brigade. The Japanese had no heavy artillery, limited air support, and supply lines that stretched back to Indochina. They would break themselves against the prepared defenses of the Singapore strategy like waves against a seawall. The Singapore strategy had been the cornerstone of British Pacific defense planning since 1923. Admiral Sir Bertram Ramsay had conceived it as an elegant solution to the problem of defending British interests across an ocean that measured 8,000 miles from Singapore to Vancouver. Rather than attempt to patrol the entire Pacific with scattered squadrons, the Royal Navy would concentrate its Eastern Fleet at the Singapore Naval Base, the largest and most modern facility between Portsmouth and Pearl Harbor. From Singapore, British naval forces could intercept any Japanese thrust toward Australia, the Dutch East Indies, or India. The Japanese would be forced to assault Singapore directly or accept that their southern expansion was blocked by British naval power. If they chose to attack, they would find themselves facing not only the Eastern Fleet but the most heavily fortified position in Southeast Asia. The Singapore fixed defenses incorporated lessons learned from the Great War, featuring interlocking fields of fire, underground command bunkers, and ammunition storage capable of sustaining a 6-month siege. The massive 15-inch guns had been manufactured at the Vickers Works in Sheffield, transported to Singapore aboard special heavy-lift vessels, and installed in reinforced concrete emplacements that could withstand direct hits from 14-inch naval shells. Each gun weighed 100 tons and could hurl a 1,938-pound projectile 25 miles with accuracy sufficient to sink a battleship with a single hit. Whitfield had inspected the fixed defenses during his first week in Singapore, accompanying a staff delegation from Lieutenant General Arthur Percival's headquarters at Fort Canning. The tour was conducted by Major Harold Briggs of the Royal Artillery, a thin, precise man who had overseen the installation of the naval guns in 1938. Briggs explained the defensive concept with obvious pride, pointing out the overlapping fields of fire that covered every approach from the South China Sea. Battery Johore commanded the eastern approaches with 2 15-inch guns. Battery Wallace covered the central shipping channel with another pair of 15-inch weapons. Batteries Connaught and Silingsing controlled the western approaches with additional naval guns and heavy coastal artillery. The guns could engage targets at maximum range with devastating effect, but their primary mission was to prevent Japanese naval forces from entering the Straits of Johore and Malacca. No enemy fleet could approach Singapore without running a gauntlet of artillery fire that would destroy even the largest warships. The logic seemed unassailable. Japanese forces might capture airfields in Thailand and French Indochina, might even advance into northern Malaya, but they could not take Singapore without heavy naval support. The Imperial Japanese Navy would be forced to bring battleships and cruisers within range of the fixed defenses, where British artillery would systematically destroy them. Without naval gunfire support, Japanese ground forces could not hope to storm prepared positions defended by 85,000 troops with modern weapons and unlimited ammunition. The siege would become a war of attrition that Japan could not afford to fight. Their supply lines to the home islands would be vulnerable to attack by British submarines and carrier aircraft operating from Ceylon and Australia. The longer the siege continued, the more likely that American forces would intervene to relieve Singapore. Japan might win initial victories through surprise and local superiority, but they could not sustain a campaign against the combined industrial might of the British Empire and the United States. Whitfield had accepted this reasoning without question. Like most British officers of his generation, he had been educated to believe that European troops with modern equipment were inherently superior to Asian opponents regardless of numerical odds. The Japanese had scored impressive victories against Chinese forces, but Chinese armies lacked proper training, adequate weapons, and competent leadership. The British possessed all three in abundance. The 2nd Battalion, Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders had been formed in 1881 and had fought with distinction on the northwest frontier in South Africa and at Gallipoli. The men were professionals who had volunteered for military service and had been trained to the highest standards of the British Army. They carried the latest Lee-Enfield rifles, Bren light machine guns, and Boy's anti-tank rifles. The battalion's supporting artillery consisted of modern 25-pounder field guns capable of engaging targets at ranges up to 13,000 yards. Japanese forces might outnumber individual British units, but they could not match British firepower, British training, or British determination. The first indication that the Singapore strategy contained fatal flaws came on December 8, 1941, when Japanese aircraft attacked the RAF airfields at Kota Baru and Alor Star simultaneously with the Pearl Harbor strike. Within 6 hours, Japanese forces had destroyed or damaged 60 British aircraft on the ground and established air superiority over northern Malaya. The Japanese 25th Army landed at Kota Baru, Singora, and Patani under cover of darkness, deploying over 18,000 troops with supporting artillery and armor. By midday on December 8th, Lieutenant General Yamashita had established secure beachheads and was advancing inland against disorganized British resistance. The speed of the Japanese assault stunned British commanders who had expected weeks of preparation before any major offensive. Intelligence reports had suggested that Japanese forces were concentrated in Indochina and would require extensive logistical preparation before launching amphibious operations. The coordinated attacks on December 8 demonstrated that Japanese planning had been far more sophisticated than British estimates suggested. The loss of air superiority proved catastrophic for British defensive plans. The RAF had based its Malayan strategy on the assumption that modern fighter aircraft could intercept Japanese bomber formations and inflict losses sufficient to discourage sustained air attacks. British fighters would dominate Japanese aircraft in individual combat, forcing enemy bombers to operate at night or in weather conditions that reduced their effectiveness. The reality proved entirely different. Japanese pilots flying Mitsubishi A6M0 fighters demonstrated skills and tactics that shocked British aircrews. The Zero possessed superior maneuverability, longer range, and more experienced pilots than intelligence reports had indicated. British Brewster Buffalo fighters, considered adequate for colonial service, were systematically destroyed by Japanese pilots who exploited every weakness in British aircraft and tactics. Within 72 hours of the initial attacks, effective British air resistance had ceased to exist. The psychological impact of losing air superiority affected British ground forces immediately. Units that had trained for defensive operations with close air support found themselves exposed to constant attack by Japanese aircraft that operated with impunity. The Japanese 25th Army employed close air support with a sophistication that exceeded anything British forces had experienced. Japanese pilots coordinated with ground commanders through radio communications, providing tactical intelligence and precision strikes against British positions. British troops who had never faced sustained air attack discovered that even well-constructed defensive positions offered little protection against coordinated aerial assault. Men began to abandon prepared positions not because they were overrun by Japanese ground forces, but because sustained bombing and strafing made them uninhabitable. Whitfield first encountered Japanese air power on December 12 when his battalion was ordered to establish blocking positions along the Perak River. The 2nd Battalion, Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders, had been tasked with delaying Japanese forces advancing south from Ipoh, while the 11th Indian Division prepared defensive positions further south. The battalion occupied well-sited positions on high ground overlooking the main road, with clear fields of fire and good cover from small arms. The men were confident in their ability to hold the position against Japanese infantry attacks. The battalion's 2-inch mortars and supporting artillery from the 137th Field Regiment could break up any assault before it reached the British lines. Japanese aircraft appeared over the British positions at 0730 hours on December 13. 12 Nakajima Ki-43 Oscar fighters conducted a reconnaissance sweep, circling the British positions at low altitude while taking photographs and noting defensive preparations. British anti-aircraft fire was ineffective. The battalion's only air defense weapons were rifle fire and a single Lewis gun that had been retained for training purposes. The Japanese pilots completed their reconnaissance without interference and departed to the north. Whitfield assumed they were gathering intelligence for a ground attack that would come later in the day or during the hours of darkness. The airstrike began at 0945 hours with 18 Mitsubishi Ki-21 Sally bombers escorted by 24 Zero fighters. The Japanese formation approached from the northeast, flying at 8,000 feet altitude in precise formation. British observers had no warning system beyond visual identification. Radio communications with RAF headquarters had been disrupted by previous attacks. The battalion's signaller attempted to contact supporting artillery through field telephone, but the lines had been cut by the initial reconnaissance flight. For practical purposes, the 2nd Battalion, Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders was isolated from higher command and supporting units. The bombing attack continued for 27 minutes with devastating accuracy. Japanese pilots had studied aerial photographs taken during the morning reconnaissance and identified key targets including the battalion command post, ammunition storage areas, and machine gun positions. The first wave of bombers concentrated on command and control facilities, dropping 250-kilogram bombs that penetrated existing fortifications and destroyed communication equipment. The second wave targeted weapons positions, using smaller bombs and incendiary devices that created fires difficult to extinguish. The third wave conducted area bombing designed to demoralize surviving personnel and prevent effective resistance. British casualties from the air attack exceeded 40% of battalion strength. More significantly, the psychological impact broke the unit's cohesion and fighting effectiveness. Men who had never experienced aerial bombardment discovered that their training and experience provided no preparation for sustained attack from aircraft operating beyond the range of effective retaliation. The few officers who attempted to maintain order found their commands ignored by troops seeking shelter in whatever cover they could find. When Japanese ground forces appeared 2 hours later, they encountered sporadic resistance from scattered groups rather than coordinated defensive fire from prepared positions. The 2nd Battalion, Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders ceased to exist as an effective fighting unit without engaging in serious ground combat with Japanese infantry. The collapse of British resistance in northern Malaya followed the same pattern throughout December and January. Units that had prepared for conventional ground warfare found themselves unable to cope with Japanese air superiority and unconventional tactics. Japanese forces advanced through terrain that British planners had considered impassable, using bicycles and light equipment that allowed rapid movement through rubber plantations and secondary roads. Japanese commanders demonstrated tactical flexibility that exploited every weakness in British defensive planning. Where British forces expected frontal attacks against prepared positions, Japanese units infiltrated through jungle terrain and attacked from unexpected directions. Where British commanders concentrated their forces for defensive stands, Japanese aircraft provided accurate intelligence that guided artillery fire and airstrikes. Where British units attempted to withdraw to new positions, Japanese forces were already in position to intercept them. Lieutenant General Percival's operational reports to the War Office in London maintained optimistic assessments throughout the withdrawal down the Malayan Peninsula. British forces were conducting a planned fighting withdrawal that would draw Japanese forces away from their supply bases and into prepared defensive positions. The loss of territory was temporary. British forces retained their organizational integrity and fighting effectiveness. Japanese advances were costly and unsustainable. They were outrunning their supply lines and would be vulnerable to counterattack once British reinforcements arrived. The Singapore fixed defenses remained intact and fully operational. The Japanese could not hope to capture Singapore without naval support, and the Royal Navy retained control of the sea approaches. The reality was quite different. British forces were disintegrating under the combined pressure of Japanese air attacks, unconventional ground tactics, and systematic intelligence failures. Unit after unit broke contact with higher headquarters and fell back in disorder, abandoning prepared positions and heavy equipment. Officers lost control of their men. Soldiers lost confidence in their officers. The retreat became a rout as British forces discovered that Japanese units were consistently faster, better informed, and more aggressive than intelligence reports had suggested. By January 15th, effective British resistance had collapsed throughout Malaya. Japanese forces were advancing on multiple axes toward Singapore with minimal opposition. Whitfield reached Singapore on January 28 as part of a composite unit formed from survivors of 3 destroyed battalions. The 2nd Battalion, Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders, existed only on paper. Fewer than 180 men remained from an original strength of 847 officers and men. Most had been lost not to Japanese ground action but to air attacks, disease, and desertion during the chaotic retreat from Perak. The men who reached Singapore were exhausted, demoralized, and had lost confidence in British leadership at every level. They had witnessed the systematic destruction of forces they had believed were invincible and had seen Japanese tactical superiority demonstrated repeatedly under combat conditions. Singapore itself appeared secure from Japanese attack. The massive fixed defenses dominated the sea approaches with artillery that could sink any ship within 25 miles. The naval base at Sembawang contained fuel, ammunition, and maintenance facilities adequate to support the entire Eastern Fleet through a prolonged siege. Food supplies were sufficient for 6 months of normal consumption. Rationing could extend that period indefinitely. The garrison had been reinforced by fresh units including the 18th British Infantry Division, which had arrived directly from the United Kingdom with modern equipment and high morale. The combined British and Commonwealth forces totaled over 70,000 troops even after losses in Malaya. Japanese forces were estimated at less than 30,000 effectives after 3 months of continuous operations. The civilian population of Singapore maintained confidence in British defensive capabilities despite reports of Japanese advances in Malaya. Government officials assured residents that Singapore was prepared for a siege of unlimited duration. The military authorities imposed blackout restrictions and evacuation procedures, but these were presented as routine precautions rather than emergency measures. Business continued normally. Schools remained open. Social events proceeded as scheduled. The European community in particular refused to believe that Japanese forces represented a serious threat to British rule. Japan was a second-rate power with obsolete equipment and poorly trained soldiers who had succeeded in Malaya only because of British tactical mistakes that would not be repeated at Singapore. Whitfield's first assignment in Singapore was to conduct reconnaissance of the northern shore defenses under the direction of Brigadier Ivan Simpson, the chief engineer of Malaya Command. Simpson had repeatedly requested permission to construct landward fortifications, arguing that Japanese forces might attempt to cross the Straits of Johore and attack Singapore from the north. His requests had been refused by Lieutenant General Percival on the grounds that defensive preparations facing north would damage civilian morale and suggest that Japanese forces might actually reach Singapore. The existing coastal defenses were more than adequate to repel any attack the Japanese might mount. Additional fortifications were unnecessary and would divert resources from more important projects. The reconnaissance revealed the fundamental flaw in Singapore's defensive strategy. The massive 15-inch naval guns that dominated the sea approaches were installed in fixed emplacements that could only engage targets to the south. The guns could not be traversed to fire at targets north of Singapore. Their concrete emplacements prevented any possibility of repositioning them to meet landward attacks. The ammunition storage areas contained armor-piercing shells designed for use against naval targets. High-explosive shells suitable for engaging ground targets existed in limited quantities and had not been positioned for rapid access. The gun crews had been trained exclusively for naval engagement procedures. They had never practiced firing at land targets and possessed no experience with the different ballistic calculations required for such missions. Brigadier Simpson explained the situation to Whitfield with barely controlled frustration. The Singapore fixed defenses had been designed to repel naval attack from the south. The possibility that Japanese forces might approach overland from the north had been dismissed as impractical during the original planning process. Japanese forces lacked the heavy artillery necessary to suppress the fixed defenses from landward positions. They possessed no tanks or armored vehicles capable of operations in tropical terrain. Most significantly, they had no means of crossing the Straits of Johore under fire from British positions. The northern approaches were considered naturally impassable and did not require artificial fortification. Japanese reconnaissance aircraft had been conducting systematic aerial photography of Singapore's northern defenses since January 20th. The aircraft operated at high altitude beyond the effective range of British anti-aircraft guns and completed their missions without interference. Whitfield observed several of these reconnaissance flights during his inspection tours, noting that Japanese pilots were gathering detailed intelligence about British positions, troop movements, and defensive preparations. British fighter aircraft made no attempt to intercept the reconnaissance flights. Effective British air defense had ceased to exist after the destruction of RAF facilities in Malaya. Japanese forces possessed complete information about British defensive weaknesses while British intelligence remained ignorant of Japanese intentions and capabilities. The truth became apparent to Whitfield on February 8, when he witnessed Japanese artillery fire directed at the Sembawang naval base from positions north of the Straits of Johore. The Japanese 25th Army had positioned field artillery and medium guns within range of Singapore and was systematically destroying British installations with observed fire. The accuracy of the Japanese bombardment indicated that they possessed detailed targeting information obtained through aerial reconnaissance and possibly through intelligence agents operating within Singapore. British counter-battery fire was ineffective because the Japanese guns were positioned beyond the maximum range of British artillery. The massive 15-inch naval guns that were supposed to provide ultimate defense for Singapore could not be brought to bear against targets on the Malayan shore. The Japanese crossing of the Straits of Johore began at 2,300 hours on February 8 under cover of darkness and heavy artillery fire. Advanced elements of the Japanese Imperial Guards Division and 5th Division launched simultaneous amphibious assaults using collapsible boats, rafts, and improvised ferries. The crossing points had been selected through careful reconnaissance to avoid British defensive fire and to exploit gaps in the perimeter defense. Japanese engineers had prepared detailed plans for the assault based on accurate maps and aerial photographs. The operation proceeded with a precision and coordination that shocked British defenders who had expected desperate, improvised attacks by Japanese forces cut off from their supply bases. British defensive fire was sporadic and poorly coordinated. Units manning the northern shore positions had received no training for repelling amphibious assault and possessed no experience with night combat procedures. Communication systems failed under Japanese artillery fire, preventing effective coordination between defensive positions. British commanders had no contingency plans for dealing with Japanese forces that successfully established beachheads on Singapore Island. The entire defensive strategy had been based on preventing Japanese forces from reaching the Straits of Johore, not on repelling them after they arrived. Whitfield observed the initial Japanese landings from his position at the brigade headquarters of the 27th Australian Infantry Brigade. Japanese forces demonstrated tactical proficiency that exceeded anything British intelligence had predicted. The landing craft approached shore in precise formation despite darkness and heavy seas. Japanese infantry disembarked under fire and immediately established secure perimeters around their beachheads. Japanese engineers deployed bridging equipment and heavy weapons with remarkable efficiency. Within 4 hours of the initial landings, Japanese forces had established 3 separate beachheads and were expanding inland against disorganized British resistance. The psychological impact of the Japanese landings shattered British defensive morale throughout Singapore. Units that had maintained confidence despite the disasters in Malaya discovered that Japanese forces possessed the capability to overcome obstacles that British planners had considered insurmountable. The Straits of Johore, which had been described as a natural barrier equivalent to the English Channel, had been crossed by Japanese forces using improvised equipment and tactical skills. If Japanese forces could achieve the impossible once, they might achieve it repeatedly. The massive fixed defenses that had guaranteed Singapore's security were revealed as obsolete installations designed for a type of warfare that no longer existed. Lieutenant General Percival's final operational conference took place at Fort Canning on February 14, with Japanese forces advancing toward the city center from 3 directions. British and Commonwealth casualties exceeded 15,000 killed, wounded, and missing. Ammunition supplies were nearly exhausted. Food and water were running short. Civilian casualties from Japanese artillery fire and air attacks were mounting hourly. The naval base at Sembawang had been captured intact, providing Japanese forces with fuel and ammunition for continued operations. The fixed defenses remained operational but could not engage Japanese forces attacking from landward positions. Brigadier Simpson presented the engineering assessment of Singapore's defensive situation with characteristic bluntness. The landward defenses consisted of improvised positions that could not withstand sustained assault by determined troops. British forces had been reduced to less than 50,000 effectives, many of whom were untrained reinforcements who had never fired their weapons in combat. Japanese forces numbered approximately 35,000 troops, but they possessed complete air superiority, unlimited ammunition, and high morale resulting from an unbroken series of victories. More significantly, Japanese forces had demonstrated tactical superiority in every engagement during the Malayan campaign. There was no reason to believe that British performance would improve during street fighting in Singapore. The surrender negotiations began on February 15, when Lieutenant General Percival met with Lieutenant General Yamashita at the Ford Motor Factory on Bukit Timah Road. The Japanese commander demanded unconditional surrender of all British and Commonwealth forces in Singapore, immediate cessation of resistance, and preservation of all military installations and civilian facilities. British forces would become prisoners of war and would be treated according to Japanese interpretation of international law. The civilian population would remain under Japanese military administration until further notice. Whitfield was among the British officers who witnessed the surrender ceremony at 1910 hours on February 15, 1942. Lieutenant General Percival signed the surrender documents in the presence of Japanese military officials and newspaper correspondents. The ceremony was conducted with formal military courtesy, but the underlying reality was unmistakable. Japanese forces had achieved complete victory over British and Commonwealth troops that had outnumbered them by more than 2 to 1. The Gibraltar of the East had fallen in fewer than 70 days. The Singapore strategy that had guaranteed British security in the Pacific for 20 years had proven to be based on assumptions that no longer corresponded to military reality. The psychological impact of Singapore's fall extended far beyond Southeast Asia. British prestige throughout the empire suffered irreparable damage as news of the surrender reached India, Australia, and Africa. The myth of European military superiority over Asian opponents was permanently shattered. Japanese forces had not merely defeated British troops. They had demonstrated superior tactics, superior planning, and superior leadership at every level of military operations. The implications for continued British rule in Asia were catastrophic and irreversible. Whitfield spent the remainder of the war in Japanese prisoner-of-war camps, first at Changi Prison in Singapore and later at various work sites along the Thai-Burma Railway. The experience provided him with detailed knowledge of Japanese military organization and capabilities that confirmed his observations during the Malayan campaign. Japanese forces possessed institutional advantages that went far beyond individual courage or temporary tactical success. Their military education system produced officers who understood modern warfare better than their British counterparts. Their training methods created soldiers who could adapt to unexpected situations and exploit opportunities with remarkable initiative. Their logistical organization supported sustained operations under conditions that would paralyze British forces. The construction of the Thai-Burma Railway demonstrated Japanese engineering capabilities that British intelligence had consistently underestimated. Japanese forces completed a 415-kilometer railroad through terrain that British experts had considered impassable using prisoner labor, improvised equipment, and locally available materials. The project required bridging major rivers, cutting through mountainous terrain, and solving supply problems that would have challenged the best British engineers. Japanese supervisors demonstrated technical knowledge and organizational skills that matched or exceeded anything Whitfield had observed in the British Army. The treatment of prisoners of war revealed aspects of Japanese military culture that explained their tactical superiority during the Malayan campaign. Japanese officers possessed absolute authority over their subordinates and expected immediate, unquestioning obedience to orders. Japanese soldiers were trained to endure physical hardship without complaint and to maintain discipline under the most severe conditions. Individual initiative was encouraged within the framework of mission orders that defined objectives while allowing tactical flexibility in execution. The combination of strict discipline and tactical flexibility had enabled Japanese forces to adapt to changing conditions faster than British units could respond. Japanese intelligence capabilities proved far superior to anything British forces had possessed in Malaya. Japanese agents had been operating throughout Southeast Asia for years before the war began, gathering detailed information about British military installations, troop movements, and defensive plans. Japanese diplomatic personnel, business representatives, and civilian residents had systematically collected intelligence that was forwarded to military planning organizations. When the war began, Japanese forces possessed accurate maps, current intelligence assessments, and detailed knowledge of British capabilities and intentions. British intelligence, by contrast, had consistently underestimated Japanese capabilities and had failed to provide accurate assessments of enemy intentions. The broader strategic implications of Singapore's fall became apparent during Whitfield's imprisonment as Japanese forces continued their expansion throughout Southeast Asia and the Pacific. The Dutch East Indies fell within weeks of Singapore's surrender, providing Japan with access to the oil resources that sustained their war effort. Japanese naval forces advanced into the Indian Ocean, threatening British communications with India and forcing the Eastern Fleet to withdraw to East Africa. Japanese army units invaded Burma and advanced toward the Indian frontier, raising the possibility that British rule in India might collapse completely. The entire structure of British power in Asia was disintegrating under the pressure of Japanese advances that had seemed impossible before December 1941. The psychological transformation of European colonial populations throughout Asia followed predictable patterns. Asian peoples who had been taught to regard European rule as permanent and inevitable discovered that European military forces could be defeated by Asian opponents using superior tactics and organization. The myth of white supremacy that had sustained colonial rule for centuries was permanently destroyed by Japanese victories that demonstrated Asian capability for modern warfare. Even after Japanese forces were eventually defeated, the colonial populations retained the knowledge that European military superiority was temporary and conditional rather than permanent and inevitable. Whitfield's release from Japanese captivity came in August 1945, following the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki and the Soviet declaration of war against Japan. The Japanese surrender was as sudden and unexpected as their initial victories had been 3.5 years earlier. Japanese forces that had seemed invincible in 1942 collapsed with remarkable speed once their strategic situation became hopeless. The same organizational discipline that had made them formidable opponents enabled them to accept defeat and occupation with minimal resistance. The post-war analysis of the Singapore campaign revealed the full extent of British intelligence failures and strategic miscalculations. Japanese planning for the Malayan operation had begun in 1940 with detailed studies of British defensive capabilities and potential weaknesses. Japanese staff officers had identified the fundamental flaw in the Singapore strategy long before the war began. The fixed defenses were designed exclusively to repel naval attack and could not be used against landward assault. Japanese forces had developed specific tactics to exploit this weakness, including amphibious assault techniques, jungle warfare procedures, and air-ground coordination methods that British forces were unprepared to counter. The speed of the Japanese advance through Malaya had been achieved through superior logistics and transportation methods rather than numerical superiority. Japanese forces used bicycles, light equipment, and local transportation to maintain mobility that British forces could not match. Japanese supply organizations were able to sustain operations over extended distances using improvised methods and local resources. British forces, trained to depend on mechanical transport and elaborate supply systems, were unable to adapt to conditions that Japanese forces accepted as normal. The air superiority that proved decisive in the Malayan campaign resulted from Japanese tactical innovations that British intelligence had failed to recognize. Japanese pilots had developed combat techniques specifically designed to exploit weaknesses in British aircraft and tactics. Japanese air-ground coordination procedures enabled close air support with an accuracy and effectiveness that British forces had never encountered. Japanese aircraft maintenance and supply systems sustained higher operational rates than British planners had thought possible under tropical conditions. The broader lessons of the Singapore campaign extended beyond Southeast Asia to influence military thinking throughout the post-war world. The defeat of European forces by Asian opponents demonstrated that technological superiority and individual courage were insufficient to guarantee military success. Superior organization, better intelligence, and more effective leadership could overcome numerical and material disadvantages under the right conditions. The psychological factors that influenced military effectiveness were as important as physical capabilities in determining campaign outcomes. Whitfield returned to Britain in September 1945 as one of the few surviving officers of the 2nd Battalion, Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders who had witnessed the entire Malayan campaign from beginning to end. His debriefing reports provided British military intelligence with detailed assessments of Japanese tactical capabilities and organizational methods that had not been available during the war. The information was too late to influence the Pacific War, but it proved valuable for understanding the broader implications of Asian military modernization and the changing nature of warfare in the post-war world. The reconstruction of Singapore as a British naval base proceeded slowly and encountered numerous obstacles that demonstrated how completely the strategic situation had changed. Local populations were no longer willing to accept European colonial rule without question. Asian nationalist movements had been encouraged by Japanese victories and were demanding independence or substantial autonomy. The economic resources necessary to maintain large military installations in distant locations were no longer available to Britain after 6 years of total war. Most significantly, the United States had emerged as the dominant naval power in the Pacific, making British naval presence in Southeast Asia redundant from a strategic perspective. The final irony of the Singapore strategy became apparent during the post-war analysis of Japanese planning documents. Japanese military leaders had never considered a direct naval assault on Singapore to be feasible. They had recognized from the beginning that the fixed defenses made any seaborne attack prohibitively costly. The Japanese strategy had always been based on the assumption that Singapore could only be captured through landward assault after the conquest of Malaya. British planners had spent 20 years preparing for an attack that their opponents had never intended to make while ignoring the threat that Japanese forces actually posed. The massive 15-inch guns of the Singapore fixed defenses were scrapped in 1956 as part of the general reduction in British military commitments east of Suez. The concrete emplacements were converted to other uses or abandoned to the tropical vegetation that gradually reclaimed them. The naval base at Sembawang was transferred to the Royal Malaysian Navy and later to the Singapore Armed Forces following independence. The strategic importance that had made Singapore the Gibraltar of the East gradually shifted to other locations as the balance of power in the Pacific was reconfigured around American naval bases and alliance systems. Whitfield's final assessment of the Singapore campaign, written for the British Army's Official History Project in 1957, emphasized the psychological dimensions of military effectiveness that had been overlooked during the pre-war planning process. British forces had entered the campaign with assumptions about Asian military capabilities that proved to be completely incorrect. Japanese forces had demonstrated superiority not merely in individual battles but in the fundamental understanding of modern warfare that enabled them to exploit British weaknesses systematically. The defeat had been inevitable once Japanese forces gained air superiority and demonstrated their ability to operate effectively in tropical terrain. The broader implications of Singapore's fall extended beyond military considerations to influence British policy throughout the post-war period. The realization that British military forces could be defeated by Asian opponents using superior tactics and organization contributed to the decision to accelerate decolonization in Asia and Africa. The economic and military resources necessary to maintain colonial rule against determined opposition were no longer available after the wartime devastation of Britain's industrial base. The psychological impact of military defeat had permanently undermined the prestige and authority that had sustained British colonial rule for centuries. The transformation of Singapore from British naval base to independent city-state illustrated the broader changes in the Pacific balance of power that resulted from the Pacific War. The strategic location that had made Singapore valuable to British imperial planning remained important, but the nature of that importance changed completely. Instead of serving as a base for British naval power, Singapore became a commercial and financial center that served the economic development of Southeast Asia. The same geographic advantages that had made Singapore a natural fortress also made it a natural entrepot for regional trade and investment. The memory of Singapore's fall continued to influence British strategic thinking throughout the Cold War period. British military leaders who had witnessed the collapse of supposedly impregnable defenses remained skeptical of strategies that depended on fixed fortifications or assumed enemy capabilities. The lessons of the Malayan campaign emphasized the importance of maintaining tactical flexibility, accurate intelligence, and realistic assessments of enemy capabilities. Most significantly, the Singapore experience demonstrated that military effectiveness depended as much on understanding the enemy as on possessing superior equipment or greater numbers. The final judgment on the Singapore strategy must acknowledge both its logical foundation and its fatal flaws. The concept of concentrating British naval power at a strategically located base made perfect sense given the constraints of British resources and the apparent nature of the Japanese threat. The fixed defenses were brilliantly designed to accomplish their intended mission of repelling naval attack. The error lay not in the execution of the strategy but in its fundamental assumptions about the nature of modern warfare and Japanese capabilities. British planners had prepared for the war they expected to fight rather than the war they actually faced. Lieutenant Colonel James Whitfield died in Edinburgh in 1978, one of the last survivors of the 2nd Battalion, Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders who had witnessed the fall of Singapore. His personal papers, donated to the Imperial War Museum, contained detailed notes on Japanese tactical methods and organizational procedures that provided valuable insights into the reasons for British defeat in Malaya. His final observation, written shortly before his death, emphasized the human dimension of military effectiveness that was often overlooked in official analyses. The Japanese did not defeat us because they were braver or stronger or better equipped. They defeated us because they understood warfare better than we did, and they were willing to adapt their methods to the actual conditions they faced rather than the conditions they preferred to face. The guns that should have protected the British Empire in the Pacific pointed steadfastly toward the sea until the day they were dismantled, never having fired a shot in anger at the enemy that mattered. They had been built to fight the last war, installed to defeat the last enemy, positioned to protect against the last threat. When the real war came, from the real enemy, presenting the real threat, they could only watch helplessly as the empire they were meant to defend crumbled into the jungle behind them. In the end, that was the epitaph not just of the fixed defenses, but of the entire imperial system they had been designed to protect, magnificent in conception, flawless in execution, and utterly irrelevant to the world that actually emerged from the smoke and chaos of total war. The morning sun rose over Singapore on February 16, 1942, illuminating a city under Japanese occupation for the first time in its history. The Union Jack no longer flew over Fort Canning. Japanese sentries patrolled the waterfront where British naval vessels had once anchored. The great naval base at Sembawang served new masters who had achieved in 70 days what British planners had believed impossible under any circumstances. The Gibraltar of the East had fallen, and with it, the certainty that European military superiority was a permanent feature of the modern world. In the years that followed, as the Pacific War expanded into the greatest naval conflict in history, the lessons of Singapore influenced strategic thinking in Washington, Tokyo, and London. The age of fixed defenses and static strategies had ended in the rubble of Malayan airfields and the jungle trails where British units had disintegrated under Japanese assault. The future belonged to forces that could adapt, innovate, and exploit technological advantages with tactical flexibility. The massive guns that had once guaranteed Singapore's security became monuments to a type of warfare that could no longer guarantee anything except its own obsolescence. The British Empire survived the fall of Singapore, but it never recovered from the psychological blow of watching its strongest fortress surrender to forces that intelligence reports had consistently underestimated. The myth of invincibility that had sustained colonial rule across 4 continents was permanently shattered by Japanese victories that demonstrated the conditional nature of European military superiority. In the end, Lieutenant Colonel Whitfield had been correct in his bitter assessment written from Changi Prison. The British Empire had died the moment those great guns revealed their inability to traverse and engage the enemy that actually threatened Singapore. Everything that followed was merely the prolonged agony of an empire that had already lost the will and the means to defend itself against opponents who understood the changing nature of warfare better than the defenders of the old order ever would.